I have given your professor some brief literature about myself and my contact information, and I hope he's going to distribute this to you so you can ask me any questions or have any further discussions with me whenever you feel like it. But when your professor approached me to talk today to you about issues of the development of Arabic, the relationship between Arabic and its Semitic environment, and classical Arabic, I thought that one common topic that can combine all these different issues together in a meaningful and sensible way is, in fact, a perspective on how classical Arabic may have developed. And of course, this has come to my mind first because currently I'm working on writing a book about the development of classical Arabic, both as a contact phenomenon and as a sociolinguistic phenomenon as well. So this is generally what I am going to talk about. It's my perspective on how classical Arabic may, in fact, have developed. I heard that the time we have allocated for today is 1 hour and 20 minutes. I'm not planning to talk for 1 hour and 20 minutes. I am planning to talk for much less than that. So if you have any questions, please try to jot them down so we can have a discussion after I am done with laying out very generally what I would like to talk about today. And now let me start with saying that, in fact, generally speaking, the history of the Arabic language, main basic varieties of Arabic, their development, and also the relationship between Arabic and its Semitic environment, the position of Arabic within the Semitic languages, are all victims of ideology and perspective. That is to say, both traditional Arab grammarians and their modern extension, the Arabs in modern times, and Western scholars of Arabic have, in fact, seen the history of Arabic, generally speaking, and its different varieties, in particular, through an ideological lens. And I'll explain that in a second. Most scholars in the field, for instance, have this belief that the Arabs on the Arabian Peninsula in late antiquity, before the emergence of Islam, and in the early centuries of the advent of this civilization, spoke different tribal dialects. In addition to these different tribal dialects, there was a looming variety that the Western scholars called classical Arabic, pre-classical Arabic, and modern Arab scholars call العربية or العربية. And usually there are two general groups of scholars. The Arab scholars and some Western scholars, especially in the Germanic tradition of the history of Arabic, tend to assume that in pre-Islamic times, the Arabic language, pre-classical Arabic, the Arabic of the Quran, and pre-Islamic poetry was a language that the Arabs used on daily basis. And all the Arabs spoke that variety with very minute and quote-unquote stylistic differences. The most true to the Quranic model and the most true to the poetic model was assumed to be Quraysh as a symbol for the whole region of the Hijaz. This seems to be the ideological position of modern Arab scholars. And those scholars justify the dialectal differences after the emergence of the Islam by a time-honored theory among the Arabs of corruption, meaning that the generations after the emergence of Islam who moved to the conquered territories, in fact, mixed with the indigenous populations who tried to learn Arabic. In the process, they corrupted the language. Hence, the dialects were created. This is the justification modern Arab scholars present, and also some Western scholars with degrees and variations, especially Versteeg and Johann Fugger. The majority of Western scholars, however, belong to three different categories of understanding classical Arabic and its pre-classical form. One group tends to assume, and I use the verb deliberately, assume that classical Arabic and its pre-Islamic form was not only the language of poetry, but was also the language spoken by tribal dialects, especially on the Najdi Plateau and in Eastern Arabia. Another group tended to assume, or tends to assume, that in fact, this classical Arabic and its pre-classical model were not used by anybody as a native language on the Arabian Peninsula at the time of Islam. It was, however, used as a standard or a refined language for particular circumstances, something that to a degree resembles the diglossic situation in its simple form. The third group of Western scholars tends to assume that the pre-classical model, the language of the Quran and classical Arabic, were not used as a native language, were not used in a diglossic situation. They were an artistic form, meaning it was a form of Arabic used only for the production of poetry in pre-Islamic times. The Quran used the model in the early first century, and then the model was expanded afterwards. To this group, I belong with Swettler. This understanding, all these understandings, except the third group of Western scholars that sees classical Arabic and pre-classical Arabic as Kunstsprache, a language of art, do not have linguistic or sociolinguistic or even historical body of evidence to support the claim. That's why I used the verb assume. The group that sees classical and pre-classical Arabic as a language of art has two kinds of evidence: positive evidence and evidence of absence. The positive evidence is that all the products of pre-classical Arabic, namely pre-Islamic poetry, tend to be quite formulaic in structure and in lexicon. We have no other evidence of this variety in pre-Islamic times, meaning that all the evidence we have from pre-Islamic Arabia tends to point at poetry, hence the art, and it's quite formulaic, which means that this kind of language was most probably not used for forms of expression other than the arts, other than poetry. So that's the positive evidence we have. There is also an evidence of absence. And that is, as I just mentioned, there is no other text in pre-classical Arabic that are not poetry, except one very notable text, namely the Quran. So until there is further evidence to point out in any other direction, we have to believe that classical Arabic, before the emergence of Islam and the revelation of the Quran, was used only for poetry, for the production of poetry. Then, if one looks at the Quran, one understands that, in fact, as a cultural product, the Quran is a linguistic anomaly. Meaning, it uses the language, the form dedicated for poetry, to produce non-poetic text. And this form, I'm not calling it a variety yet, this form shares with classical Arabic and pre-Islamic poetry two very important features. First, a structural diversity, and second, a lexical depth. So structural diversity means that the language of the Quran has many structures that come from different dialectal backgrounds in pre-Islamic Arabia. Structural features that exist only in Najdi or Eastern dialects, and structural features that exist in Hijazi dialects. At the same time, the vocabulary of the Quran is also an amalgamation of the vocabulary of the pre-Islamic dialects as a whole. So structurally and lexically speaking, the Quran is like pre-Islamic poetry. You cannot identify it as a product of a single dialect. Right? And so generally speaking, The scholars who assume that pre-classical Arabic and classical Arabic is a variety that existed before the emergence of Islam find it very difficult to place this variety in a particular position in the Semitic family of languages, because it shares different features with different branches of the family, as it shares different features with different dialects of Arabic. We are still in a very fluid situation with placing classical Arabic in a particular group in the Semitic languages. I'll give you an example, just for the sake of illustration, and I will not dwell on it for a long time. The Arabic language is generally categorized within the North Arabian group of languages. But that North Arabian group of languages, this Arabic language in general, shares with the Ethiopian group of languages the phenomenon of broken plurals. The phenomenon of verbs of existence, kana wa akhawatuha, which other North Arabian languages do not share, right? So although the Arabic language also is categorized among this North Arabian group of languages, it shares with Akkadian some features. In case marking and some phonological features as well. So all I want to say from these two quick examples that Arabic does not rest comfortably in one place in the Semitic languages, just simply because, in fact, it was assumed to be a variety, while in reality it may very well have not been. Now, one might ask the question, is not classical Arabic now a variety of Arabic? Isn't it now a dialect of its own that has its own structural features? The answer to this is yes. It is a variety of Arabic now. Now, when did classical Arabic move from just being a form or a group of traditions used for linguistic expression to a complete variety of the Arabic language? And what I am going to talk to you about today is, in fact, that between the 2nd century, the 8th century, and the 4th, 10th century, the Arabic language the classical Arabic has shifted from a form to a variety of its own through a process of standardization. We can understand something about this process if we look at the sources, medieval Arabic texts, very broadly. Namely, if we look at Arabic grammars between the 2nd and the 4th century, if we look at books, manuals of Quranic readings in the 3rd and the 4th centuries, if we look at commonplace books like al-Bayan wa-Tabyin or the Majalis books, and finally, if we look at introductions for Arabic linguistics, such as a Sahibi by Ibn Faris. A very broad general look at these different sources will show us a very interesting picture. That generally speaking, between the 2nd century of the Islamic era, which is the 8th in the Common Era, and the 4th century of the Islamic era, which is the 10th of the Common Era, a process of selection was taking place. It's a process of selecting forms or variants of particular features to become more preferred and then standardized. By the end of the process, every structure which has 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different dialectal variants started from a hierarchical organization of which is more preferred than the rest, while everything is absolutely correct in Arabic, into something that is fasih and the rest as shad by the end of the process. This process of selection is in fact different, meaning that the process of selecting the sounds of classical Arabic differed from the process of selecting morphemes and structures of classical Arabic. A look at the sources will show that the process of selecting the sounds of classical Arabic depended entirely on the sociolinguistic, the non-linguistic, social prestige that the Hijaz region in particular, and the Quraysh region in particular, enjoyed. Meaning that because Quraysh and the Hijaz were in a higher sociocultural prestige for different obvious reasons, of course. The sound patterns, pronunciations, and expressions of Quraysh and the Hijaz region were selected and preferred over the sounds of the other tribal affiliations. For instance, I'm now writing an article about the Kashkasha and Keskasa phenomenon. I am wondering if you guys know what Kashkasha and Keskasa is. Quickly, Kashkasha is pronouncing the pronouncing the ka sound in the 2nd person feminine singular suffix pronoun as cha, right? So instead of saying kitabu ki, you would say kitabuchi or kitabuchi, right? And the Keskasa is pronouncing the same 2nd person feminine singular with an aspiration at the end. So instead of saying kitabu ki, you would say kitabat. And this is a phenomenon that Arabs in the 2nd century, especially Sibawayhi and Al-Khalil ibn Ahmad, realized as a regular morphological variation for the 2nd person feminine singular. And they treated it as just simply a variant. But by the 4th century, we see, yes, that it's a variant, and it's an Arabic variant, but it's not a Fasih variant. It, in fact, is shad. The notion of shad in Arabic, in medieval Arabic grammar, does not mean anomalous. It means more means more limited in use than it is anomalous, right? So it is fine, but it's limited in use. And that means it's limited in the use, in the pronunciation of classical Arabic, because in reality, the phenomenon of kashkasha and kaskasa was more widespread than the other variants on the Arabian Peninsula. It was used in Najd, it was used in Eastern and Northeastern Arabia, but it was not used in Hijaz, because Hijaz was sociolinguistically more prestigious. Its variant was used. And the kashkasha variant became stigmatized as less fasih and shad. This same process, in fact, happened in the selection of every phonological variant in the pronunciation of classical Arabic, such as in imala, such as in the taltala, kaskasa, kashkasha. But if we turn to look at the process of selection for morphological and syntactic features, we will notice that it's different. I published earlier this year an article in Eurasian Arabic Studies. I think it's issue number 14. The process of selecting morphological and syntactic features for classical Arabic depended entirely on the availability of data rather than on sociocultural prestige. So I collected and counted in the kitab of Sibawayhi the numbers of poets used for illustration and the generation of rules. And I found that Sibawayhi used 1,056 full lines of poetry, as opposed to 416 Quranic verses. So 1,056 tokens of poetry versus 416 tokens of the Quran. And there is all those tokens of poetry came from, the majority of them came from pre-Islamic poetry. The second largest group of tokens came from early Islamic poets who started their career before the emergence of Islam and ended their careers during the early years of Islam. The third and the smallest group of poetic tokens came from Islamic poets. in the first 150 years of the emergence of Islam. The majority of these poets in general came from Najd and northeast Arabia, who spoke a particular dialect, which differed from the dialects of the Hijaz. And the largest representation for these pre-Islamic poets came from Tamim, 44 poets. So the data that Sibawayhi used for analysis was quite similar to that of the Quran. And it came from eastern, northeastern dialects of Arabic. You therefore can find that the structures and the morphemes of classical Arabic resemble the Najdi dialects and the northeastern dialects quite more than they do the Hijazi dialect, especially Quraysh. So one can, in fact, look at the structures of classical Arabic through after these two different processes of selection, and think about it this way. The sounds of classical Arabic are quite akin to Hijaz, if not identical, and morphemes and structures of classical Arabic are quite akin to the Eastern and Northeastern dialects, if not identical, right? And you can trace this view and this theory in the commonplace books and introductions to linguistics, especially Sahabi. In the Majalis of Talab, for instance, you would see in more than one occasion, and I have included that in the article I'm publishing at the moment, and in the article that came earlier this year, you can see references to the supremacy and the eloquence of the Quraysh tribe whenever sound features of the Arabic language are mentioned, right? And you will always see praises of especially Tamim and northeastern dialects in general, whenever morphological and syntactic features are mentioned. I'll give you a very quick example that comes on top of my head, and it is in one occasion, and this happened came in the Majalis of Talab and in the Bayan wa Tabyin at the same time, that Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the first Umayyad Caliph, was in one of his social gatherings where he asked about the most eloquent in speech among the Arabs, and one of the attendants told him it's your tribe, namely that of Quraysh, because, and the gentleman started to list that Quraysh avoids those bad sound habits like Kashkasha of Tamim, and the Kashkasha of this tribe, and the Shanshana of which tribe. So those features, which Sibawayhi considered earlier to be just merely variants, are now considered to good to avoid, right? And that's how you understand that in these 3rd and 4th centuries, there is an attitude among common Arabs and also among scholars that that those dialectal features, sound features, are not on the same footing or the same socio-cultural level as that of Quraysh. Right? And similar anecdotes can be found in so many different places about morphological features, where the Eastern, Northeastern dialects are praised for being more fasih, more expressive than the Qurayshi or other dialects in these features. That's it. One can understand that classical Arabic is an amalgamation of forms. When grammarians of Arabic, especially in the tradition of Sibawayh, organized hierarchically what is best, what is second best, and what is acceptable, they have never included a form that is not acceptable, meaning that whatever the Arabs produced, whatever the Arabs spoke, may not be preferred, may be shadh, but it is still correct, hence usable. This means, yes, that that classical Arabic went through a process of selection, and we know which forms constitute best العربية الفصحى, classical Arabic, but we also know that variant features still exist and are correct. They are as correct as the preferred features, but they are not preferred. I'll give you a very quick example. When you study Arabic, one of the first issues you meet, especially when you are beyond the elementary level, when you are in the intermediate, that non-human plurals are, the agreement with non-human plurals is always feminine singular. Therefore, you say sayyarat kabira, or madaris saghira, right? That's absolutely correct. But also classical Arabic and the Quran can offer a different kind of agreement, can in fact use a plural agreement. Sayyarat kabirat, madaris saghirat, right? Yes, this is not the preferred form. And if you write this to your teacher, that will be wrong. You lose a point for that. But in classical Arabic, it's acceptable. Therefore, yes, classical Arabic is a standardized variety with a lot of variants and a huge room for variation. Did I talk too much?
Not exactly, but maybe they. I see they are trying to write and take notes. I think they will have many details to read and ask about, right?
I'm done. I will not go any further. If you guys have any questions, the professor can either direct them to me, or I do not know how we do this.
Okay, I have a point of personal privilege. Amalgamation, what does it mean?
Say it again. Which word again? Say it.
Amalgamation.
Ideation.
Amalgamation.
I'm sorry, Abdu, your voice cut off.
Okay, it's okay.
Oh, I couldn't hear it. I'm sorry.
No problem. I'm asking about vocabulary that I didn't understand, but I will ask about it later when the sound is clearer.
Okay. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, please. I would like you to introduce yourself and then ask the question. Yeah.
مرحبا.
اسمي موميزي. I have a question.
Please.
So, why the agreement process changed, like Sayyarat Kabirat? Because I think it's more simple and easy.
Yes,
Why?
I agree.
That's a good question.
I agree. No, but it did not change. Sayyarat Kabirat and Sayyara Kabira are two coexisting forms in pre-classical Arabic, right? In the process of selection, Sayyarat Kabira became more preferred than Sayyarat Kabirat. So feminine singular agreement was more preferred, became more preferred because it was more prevalent in the data Arab grammarians collected from pre-Islamic and early Islamic poetry. And but still, Sayyarat Kabirat existed, continued to exist. I'm sorry, continued to exist continued to exist, although it's not the preferred form. You can still see it in the Quran. But it did not change. That's what I'm trying to say. It's just less preferred.
In other words, we wonder why the preference was given to the parents.
Why preference was given to what? I'm sorry?
Given to the pattern like the Sayyarat Kabira.
Yes, preference was given to this because, as I talked about this very briefly, in the process of selection for morphology and the structures of Arabic, agreement is a structural feature. In the process for selection, Arab grammarians found more data, more reliable data for Sayyarat Kabira than for Sayyarat Kabira. Therefore, the selection was made for Sayyarat Kabira. You can see in Sibawayhi's discussion of agreement that, in fact, he tries to find justification for the existence of Sayyarat Kabirat in the Quran and in some lines of poetry, but the most prevalent features that they could find was Sayyarat Kabira. It's a data-related reason.
Actually, I am aware that Persian language uses the same pattern as Sayyarat Kabira or inanimate.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Do you hear me?
Yes. You know, it would be easier if you guys can turn off the picture, I think.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm aware that Persian language uses similar pattern as the Sayyarat Kabira. Because the inanimate nouns, the plural forms, inanimate nouns agree in the singular. And of course, the mother tongue of Siba and other early grammarians were Persian, and I wonder it could affect the standardization of the standard Arabic language. Is it possible?
Well, theoretically, it is possible. But if I am going to talk strictly from the perspective of the data that I can find in Arabic sources, in medieval Arabic sources, this assumption is valid, but there is no data to support or deny it, right? So yes, it's an interesting question to pursue, but there is nothing in the literature that could lead us in that direction.
With that,
Okay.
thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm sorry, this is not a satisfying answer. And that's an amazing question, but our main problem in the field of the history of Arabic is that sometimes we make assumptions and put them on and try to find evidence in the data rather than looking at the data and coming up with results. And that's what I'm trying to do. Therefore, I cannot go with that. I cannot go with that assumption. But let me ask you a question, if I may. Can I? What makes you come to this notion?
It was interesting to me when I learned Persian languages, Middle Eastern and language of Horn of Africa. There are so many languages that make the similar agreement system, like the plural inanimate non-human nouns are treated like a singular noun. Like,
Yeah.
I think Turkish has a similar pattern, and Somali also has a quite similar pattern. So I wondered if it could be
and Somali belongs to which group of languages?
Somali is also an Asiatic language belonging to the Afro-Asiatic.
And Turkish belongs to which group of language?
Turkish is Turkic.
Yes, is a Turkic. And Persian belongs to which group?
Indo-European language.
Exactly. It's an Indo-European language. 3 different language families have a similar agreement pattern, right? Which interestingly, in Arabic, the assumption that it is a transfer or an aerial feature is a very interesting assumption, but it faces a strong difficulty, namely that it is pervasive across the systems, meaning that it is prevalent in all morphological features and in all structural structures as well, meaning that with all pronouns, independent and suffix pronouns, with adjective agreements, with verb conjugations, and also with overall general sentence structure, even with verb initial sentences, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah. So either this is a very ancient aerial feature, or the assumption that it is not, the assumption that it is an aerial feature is not valid.
I cannot tell, but yeah, very short answer.
Mm. 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 That needs a lot of evidence, historical and linguistic. But it's certainly a very interesting theory to pursue. Other questions? Say it again, sorry?
Sorry, it's just an immediate idea. So
Other questions?
Yes, Habib. I have a comment, not a question, about the lack of evidence sometimes about the other possibilities or the unaccepted variations, because I think this is the basic problem of Arabic. When people do not approve or accept something, they don't even document it and keep it. So, but in some cases, the books of Lahn al-Amma could give some more evidence to these unaccepted forms.
Well, the books of Lahn al-Awam can give evidence to the degree of prevalence for a form. So, for instance, say case endings became a very important feature for quote unquote al-Fusha. So people would try, in the use of al-Fusha, would try to include case endings as much as they can and as correctly as they can. In the process, they make mistakes. The more and those mistakes get recorded in Kutub Lahn al-Am, right? Interestingly, what gets recorded in Kutub Lahn al-Amma are the mistakes that persist and become an error, which can be either one of two things: a dialectal interference, or a very bad, a mark of very bad education. And of course, neither is helpful in what you're talking about, in documenting a phenomenon. But you know what's really helpful in documenting an undesirable phenomenon is كتب القراءات الشاذة and شواذ القرآن. Because in those manuals, you can see both the accepted forms and the less accepted forms, the less accepted variants. Those you can rely on those in studying less accepted variants. Any other questions? Anybody? No?
No questions?
No comments?
Okay. Comments?
So then, can I ask another question?
Please, you can ask too.
Thank you. I totally agree with your opinion about the importance of standardization or classical and now I'm wondering. Actually, there are many different traditions of Quranic recitations, like tajweed. So there are the most prevalent one, I think, is the Asim Hafs tradition.
Yes.
In which we recite like Ihdina as-sirat like Sirat al-Lazina an'amta alayhim. But in some other traditions, they recite like صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم.
Yes.
Islamic discourse, both traditions are treated equally, but in actual, we choose the Asim one as the default recitation, and actually the basic pronunciation and the morphological treatment of like alayhim. We follow the Asim pattern in the Arabic education.
Yes.
I wonder why this selection was made and by whom.
Yes. Okay. This is a very interesting question, and it goes back to my point about the choice of morphological features. And when Hafs and Asim, when Asim was selected as a canonical reading, it was first by Mujahid. And Mujahid's selection was based on very strict criteria, one of which is quote unquote grammatical soundness, and the second of which is awareness of the dialectal variation. So Mujahid selected Asim because one of the reasons that was that Asim followed the Tamimi tradition of vowel harmony. So alayhim instead of alayhum. And that meets morphologically the accepted dialects of Tamim, which is a Northeast Arabian dialect. And at the same time, it comes from a sound genealogical tradition. Therefore, alayhum became qira'a shadda, while alayhim became accepted. Alayhim meets the morphological requirements for grammarians, while alayhum doesn't. Ibn Mujahid's introduction to his book, As-Sab'a, is in fact a very, very revealing introduction. He explains quite explicitly and directly his criteria for the choice of readings. And if I may add just very quick point to that as well. The choice of reading also follows the same pattern of selection. So if you notice, all the sounds of a selected reading, preferred reading, like Asim, those are sounds of Quraishi Arabic.
hint.
Mhm. Sorry, I can't hear.
بس فاهم.
Yeah, the connection is really interesting. I imagine you're saying something and you're not. So, sorry.
No,
So
he just said thanks.
Oh yeah, you're so welcome. You're so welcome. Thank you for the question. Those are actually very, very interesting points. And I would like to go further into this notion of an areal feature of agreements. Because it actually can be really interesting. We'll see. I will jot it down and we'll probably have to talk about it a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm assuming you were saying something.
yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
I will now stop the video, the recording of the video, and after that we can finalize. But I just want to make sure that I will have enough time to